That's neat. Hey guys, today we're taking the first look at the Creality Halot Ray mono resin printer. So I've already obviously unboxed it and got rid of most of the packaging materials. I should have probably kept some of them because as you're unboxing this, there's going to be a piece of styrofoam in here and the bed's going to be all the way down sandwiched against the styrofoam. The best way I've found to advise people to remove that styrofoam is just rotate the lead screw with the printer off and everything so that you slowly raise the build plate up, not sandwiching the styrofoam anymore, and then pull that out. You could do it through the screen, but if you hit the wrong button, then your build plate's actually trying to press down and making that horrible grinding noise. So just do that by hand, get all the packaging out, and then set that aside. We've obviously also got a bag of materials and goodies and a little envelope here that is replacement FET films for the bottom of the resin vat, the power cord, and in here there's the manual. So please take a few minutes and read through the manual. A bunch of what I talk about is going to make a lot more sense if you've done that. We have like a warranty card, which also has, warranty card right here. And this other card that seems to have the instructions for leveling your build plate, but it's extremely thick. So I would normally use standard printer paper for leveling my build plate. But the instructions nonetheless are on there for you. Quick reference. We have a metal scraper. So you want to be very careful with the the aluminum build plate that you don't gouge into it with this, but it's great to kind of break that seal on a corner and pop the item off, or at the very least break the seal and then use the plastic scraper for the rest. So they've given you both plastic scraper. This specifically though, if you're using it to hack off prints, you're going to damage it. What it is great for though is making sure that there's nothing in the vat and for kind of scraping the vat back into your resin jar when you're done if you're emptying the vat of resin. Speaking of putting it back in the resin jar, you're going to want to filter it. So if there's any little islands or tiny pieces of, say, supports or something, otherwise cured material that's in your resin, you want to make sure you're not putting that back into the bottle or the bag, what have you, because then the next time you're pouring those bits into your vat, and when the build plate comes down, if it crushes those little pieces in between the screen and the build plate, you can cause some damage. At the very least, you're going to probably damage the FET film and put a permanent little like crease or something in that. So filter your resin before you put it back. We have Allen keys. So you're going to need these Allen keys for the sides of the build plate here. If you are leveling your build plate, you will loosen these bolts. I'll touch on that in a little bit later. There's basically everything in here is Allen bolts of sorts. They've got 3 sizes for you. And then we have the USB stick, which has the test prints. I think there's also probably a digital version of the user guide. And you can also get the user guide off their website, of course. So we know that we have a few different ways of sending jobs to the printer. We can use the USB stick and print locally. We can connect it to Creality's cloud and print through that. Or we can just connect through Wi-Fi. So as long as your laptop or computer is on the same Wi-Fi as this, and that Wi-Fi doesn't have restrictions in place, that doesn't allow the 2 devices to talk to each other, then 100% you'll be able to do this. So most of your home environments shouldn't be a problem. I've actually got a hotspot on my phone, and so I'm going to connect the printer to the hotspot, connect my laptop, and we'll print that way. So on the screen, we'll go to Settings and Wi-Fi, and then you should see Printer Wi-Fi. So let's go to that guy and put in the password. Okay, now that we've got the password in, just hit OK, and with any luck, perfect. So one of the first things that I'd like to do is just make sure that I have the newest firmware. In a moment when we go on the computer, you'll see the firmware is listed on the website when we go to download the software. But we can do it over the air, as they say, over Wi-Fi here. So let's get out of this menu and under Update, and then do Wireless Network Update. And it says we're already up to date. If there was an update for you, you'd be prompted there and just say, OK, download, and the little circle will fill up as it downloads. It takes maybe 3 to 5 minutes or something for it to install, and then the machine reboots and you're ready to go. After that, I would do it again. because sometimes upgrades are kind of incremental. You don't just go from, say, version 1 to version 3. You have to go 1, 2, 3. So just check again until you get a message like this saying you're fully up to date. So if we go back to the main menu and then go to Settings, and under Print Settings, and under Device Control, this is where you set a password for sending print jobs to the device. So I've set a password of just ABC. If we take the lid off, earlier I mentioned being able to move the build plate up and down via the buttons on here, you know, when I was talking about removing the packaging. So that is done through print settings, Z-axis movement, because this is our, our Z, and then we have our X and our Y on the build plate. So Z-axis movement, and then back to 0. So 0 in this, if we see the little limit switch here, which is an optical limit switch, 0 is at the top. So some other resin printers, 0 is all the way down at the bottom. So for us, it's here. So if I hit back to 0, it's essentially just going to raise it all the way to the top and then stop. So that's the option you would choose if you were trying to, release the tension to remove the packaging. You can hit this at any time to stop it midway. And then if I do leveling, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to bring it all the way down to the bottom. Well, it'll 0 it first so that it knows where 0 is. And then from there, it'll bring it all the way down to the bottom so you can do your leveling activity. For a new printer, the build plate should be level from the factory, but we always want to verify, right? So we'll unscrew the vat. And on this particular vat, these screws come completely out. Some others, these screws are threaded in, so you could actually lift it by the screws. Don't do that. And lift this up and off. So there are little nubs in the bottom here that sink into these little recessed spots at the corners. So that's how it kind of locks itself in place, So just lift up and off. So before we level, just make sure that the screen is perfectly clear, cleaned off, and so is the build plate. We don't want resin to be soaking through here and getting on the screen or anything like that. I'm just going to place kind of standard printer paper down, and then on that screen I'm going to do the leveling option, which, as I said, is going to take us to the top to 0 it out, and then it'll go all the way to the bottom. Okay, so after a little bit of a wait, it's on its way down to the bottom. Should stop right there, and there is quite a bit of drag on the paper, but obviously I can still kind of move it around, left to right. So this side here has more drag than this side does. So if I was to print something on this side of the build plate, it's actually going to adhere to the build plate a little bit less than this side. So I will adjust that one by loosening the 2 Allen bolts here and here, but on this side. 1 and 2. And then pressing down equally on the front and back of the build plate. So maybe you can see it like that. Press down and then tighten these back up. Okay, so now I have much more drag on that side, still drag on this side. I don't really have much to grab over here, but we're good. And you can also check the front to back as well. So if you had cut this piece of paper in half, let's say, and placed it half and half, you could wiggle the back one to see if it's tilted front to back, and the front one. So right now we got lots of drag, we're good. I'm going to bring it back to 0 to release that. And of course, during all of that, you want to make sure that this is properly tightened down, and it should be. Okay. If you are not sure that this is level, I said it should be level from the factory, so we should be very, very close. I wasn't too concerned. But if this was if you had no idea if this was level or this was a brand new bed and you have no idea how far up or down it is, you want these loose before you bring that down to the bottom. And that way it can kind of cushion the blow. If it does hit the screen, it can slide up to the proper position. Because if this was all the way down, if these bolts had the bed or the build plate all the way down, you could end up impacting the screen, right? Like I said though, from the factory, should be very, very close, and it was. I probably could have just let that slide and it would have been fine. That first layer, or the first 4, some people do as much as 8 layers, are really overexposed. So your average layer might be 2.7 or 3 seconds, and the bottom layer is probably 30 or 40 seconds. So you're intentionally overexposing those bottom layers to really get a good contact between the first layers of the print and the bed, right? So if it was off by a tiny bit, it's probably not going to be that big of a concern, but you obviously want to get it as close as possible. So at this point, we're connected to Wi-Fi. We've got it level. We're going to throw some resin in there, And then we'll flip over to the computer software and we'll slice our first test print. On our computer, we're going to open a web browser. I happen to be using Microsoft Edge, but you could use Chrome or whatever you're comfortable with. And we'll go to Creality.com. At the top, under Support, you'll see Software and Firmware, and we'll go to the Download Center. And on the left, we'll select Resin 3D printers. And we'll look for our particular printer, the Halot Ray. Now, interestingly, I don't see it here. If we were looking for the firmware, that would be a problem, because the firmware is obviously printer specific. In this case, the Halot Box software is common to all the printers, so I can select any one of these. You would normally see the firmwares for your particular printer. We're going to do the over-the-air update from the printer itself, but down here is the common link for the slicing software, Halot Box. You can also use Chitdubox as well as Lychee. I'm not sure if they are both supporting Halot Ray at this time. So I'll click on Halot Box and download that. And when the download's complete, we're going to run it. There we go, hit open. And then your kind of standard next, read your terms of service. I agree. I'll choose the default install location. I want it in my start menu. And this will just complete in 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so we can hit Run Halot Box. Okay, so we'll select our printer on the right. We can definitely see it supports the Halot Ray here. So yes, I know what to do. Halot Ray, there's our size and the screen resolution, so hit OK. And I want to download a test model to slice myself. We know there's a couple test models on the USB stick that it came with, but I'm going to get the Amerilabs Town. This guy right here. So there's a list of the tests and how to interpret the results that you're getting to tune your settings. You're going to want to read through that and refer back to this. In the meantime, I'm just going to download the file. So once you've entered your email address, click Download STL, save that to your computer. And now back in Halot Box, you'll hit Open and select that file. The older version of this file did not have a raft included with it, so it would have just been this square base. It seems like this one contains a raft as part of the STL, probably just to ensure that people aren't having adhesion issues with their bed. You can snap the raft off at the end. That's really not what we're printing it for. We're printing it for all the detail up here. So by default, it's going to be in the center of your bed. That's fine for us. We're not going to scale it or move it. And then we would go to supports. So the default settings here for supports have it kind of raised off the bed. Normally, if this didn't have a raft, this area here would be flat on the bed, and it's going to be overexposed because our bottom layers are always extra exposed to ensure build plate adhesion. So you would normally want your item to be raised off the bed so that Normally you would want your item raised off the bed so that your overexposure on those bottom layers isn't transposed into your final part. In this case, we don't care, so we're not going to add any height. We're going to put it right back on the platform, and we're not going to use any supports. This is meant to be printed without supports. So we'll go over to Slice, and these are the default settings that are loaded when you select your printer in Halot Box. The motor speed is 3 millimeters a second, or 180 millimeters per minute. And the rising height is how high the build plate raises up after each layer is printed, kind of to allow resin to flow back in, and then it lowers back down. It's set to 3-second exposure time, which is probably a good starting point for most fast, mono printer designed resins. But follow your resin manufacturer's suggestions, especially if they have a chart or kind of a starting point for your particular printer. In this particular resin, being the 3D Resin Solutions Fast Plus, I know 2.7 works pretty well. Anywhere in that kind of range, 2.6, 2.7. The initial exposures, those bottom layers that are extra cured to ensure they're stuck on the build plate good, that's 40 seconds. That's pretty good for this resin, for sure. The rising height, being that this resin is very runny, I don't need a lot of height, and height takes time.
So I'm going to lower that to the minimum allowed amount for this printer, which is 5 millimeters. So it will raise up 5 millimeters at 3 millimeters a second, meaning it's going to take about 1.5 seconds to perform that rise. And then it'll lower it back down, taking another 1.5 seconds to lower fully back into the vat. So that gives the resin 3 seconds to kind of flow back into place. It should be more than enough. This resin's very watery. Now the turn-off delay here has interesting kind of notes off to the side. It says, as the platform descends, it takes a while to turn on the light to continue printing the next layer. The time required for this delayed turn-on process is called the turn-on delay. In doing other reading about what this is meant to mean, it's a delay after the build plate is lowered back into the vat all the way. So, it's gone up 5 and down 5. And then it's going to delay for this many seconds before it turns on the light. Through my testing on the other Halot printers, you can lower this to the minimum allowed amount. Some reading indicated that this was to limit the effect of turbulence in the resin as it's lowering back down, to make sure that everything's kind of settled and is still before the next layer is being cured. And then the number of bottom layers that we're going to overexpose for that 40 seconds. 4 is a pretty conservative number. I know this particular resin says 8. And in the case that I don't actually care what those bottom 8 layers look like in this, 8 would be perfectly fine. Maybe we'll put it to some happy medium. And then we're doing 50 millimeter layer heights. Now, if you have specific settings tuned for this printer for a certain resin, you may want to save that as a special profile so you can recall it back. So I'm going to call this 3D Resin Solutions Fast. It doesn't let me put in Fast Plus, but that's okay. And it is black. Now I'm adding the color because if this was clear, my cure times may be significantly different. The more opaque the resin is, the more different your cure times would be from something that was translucent or clear. It might be minor variances. A clear one, this might be 2.5 seconds instead of 2.7. Otherwise, you end up with overexposure artifacts, and you run another one of these tests for a different color resin to really dial that in. So I'm going to save that so I can refer to it easy in the future, and then hit slice. So this will show you layer by layer what it looks like. And if we close this, we can actually slice that down like that and look at it there. So let's go to export. Since it's already been sliced, it's ready to go. It tells us our settings that are being used. It also estimates the consumables, so 1.55 milliliters being used. It's going to weigh approximately this. That's based on some random density it has in there. We haven't put in the density for this specific resin. And the print time. So we're looking at just under 1 hour. So I can do local print, which is going to save it to my computer, and then I could throw it on the USB stick. We could do upload, which is using the Creality cloud, but I'm just going to use Wi-Fi printing, which is called remote printing. After clicking remote printing, you see print control, so that corresponds to the label on the screen on the printer, where we would set up a password to print control this machine. In this case, we haven't told HalotBox the password yet, so it says password error. So we're going to enter the password, and we entered ABC. That's what we're going to enter on the printer. So enter that and hit OK. And now it shows that the printer is free. This is what we're going to print. Here's the model of the printer, and there's the IP address on our network. So now I can hit Start Transmission. What this is going to do is transfer the sliced file to the printer, so now it's printing from the printer's memory, and then we can initiate the printing from here.
Of course, the other way that I mentioned we can print is by putting in the USB stick. So if I go to the print menu, I'll now see, this is a file that is on the memory of the printer, and then these are the files that are on the USB stick, hence the little images. So if I go to this cube, it'll load it to the printer's memory. Okay, it's verified. And so now we can see cube in the printer's memory. So at that point, I could actually unplug the USB stick and print from the memory, it's been loaded on there. And this is a, oops, I was gonna say this is a preview. First, we can choose the parameters. So when we were slicing, we've got the file parameters. That's what we sliced into the file. But we can choose printer parameters and use the settings that are on the printer. Either way, file or printer settings, you can always double check here and see what they are. So this particular print is going to be 40 seconds for that initial base layer. The rising height, this is the default for this printer, was 7 millimeters. So that's how high the build plate is going to rise after each layer. It's going to do 4 base layers. It's going to move the motor at 3 millimeters a second, which is actually quite fast. I think the other Creality printers were around 1. So we'll leave that alone. And I've sliced this for 2.8 seconds in this case. Now, that Ameritown Labs, or Amerilabs town, and the exposure is 2.8 seconds. So that's going to vary obviously depending on your resin, just like the base layer exposure would. So for the Amerilabs town test print, that's one of the reasons it's a great test print for one of your first slices. It doesn't take very much resin or time to print, and it allows you to dial in the exposure settings and take a look at the results over and over and over until you've really got something that works well for that resin that you have. So for me, say 2.8 seconds, 40 seconds on the bottom, and I know that 40 seconds is way more than I actually need. I can actually do this quite successfully at 30 seconds. And then turn off delay. So this is the amount of time that it waits after the build plate comes down for the next layer. It waits for 1 second before actually turning on the light. And apparently, there used to be issues with like thicker resins, and there'd still be like ripples in the resin, and it would cause kind of deformed sides of your item. Anyway, long story short, for a very watery resin, which many of these mono resins tend to be quite watery, 1 second has been working perfectly fine for me. But if this was your item and you found little like wobbly, greasy kind of marks on the outside of your item, assuming this is the build plate, then you may want to increase the turn off delay. So those settings look good. I'll hit OK. And then I'm going to hit start. And this is a preview of what it looks like. So this little guy is the Amerilabs town. This is a great first print because it doesn't take much time, doesn't waste much resin, and it really allows us to dial in our settings for our particular resin. These test files here and the times associated with them, I don't know what resin that was designed for. I'm sure it would probably print fine on mine, but I wouldn't be getting the optimum result. This allows me to print this multiple times, maybe checking out their settings as a good starting point, and dialing it in for my specific resin. So I would suggest you check out their website for a list of the individual features on here and exactly what conclusions to draw from how it's turned out for you. But in my case, I think 2.7 or 2.8 seconds for this particular resin was working fantastic in this machine. It's kind of checked off all the boxes as far as evaluating the outcome of the print. The one thing that it wasn't able to resolve is some of the detail on these little spires here. There's 5 rows of them, and the 5th row just ends up looking like a couple little hairs, and they're just kind of falling over. They can't even stand up under their own weight. So those didn't really turn out well, and I don't know if that level of detail can really be expected from this machine, or any machine for that matter. I've never had one that's actually rendered those 5th row. But it turned out great, and now that I know my settings for my resin, I'm ready to start printing longer prints. So one of the test files we looked at there was called the cube, and this is the result. Now it didn't look like this on the printer. It was printed as individual components, and they were printed flat on the bed like this, without this little stick. So they were printed flat on the bed like this. So they're not very high. Even the large pyramid pieces are not very high at all. And because our print time is only based on the height, not X and Y amount of build plate being full, it didn't take very long to print. But the end result is super cool. So it's not really so much a cube on the inside, it's more of like a weird triangular prism kind of shape, and it's got all these holes. And within those holes goes these little pegs. Now, this particular peg's been broken, but there's normally 2 sides to this piece, and they kind of pinch together. And so I've placed the pegs in the holes, and then carefully slid the individual pyramid pieces onto those pegs, which locks them in like this. And at the end of the day, you have a cube, and if you turn those smaller pyramids, the entire thing rotates and eventually rotates all the way back into a cube again. If you're lucky, kind of hard to do, there we go. And each piece has like this super cool little design on it. Now, if you had the original files, those little pegs that broke in my case, as I was trying to cram them in there, I would just reprint one of those little pegs, and it would take, maybe 10 minutes or something to print. But in this case, it's pre-sliced, so I have to print the entire thing, and I didn't really want to go through that exercise. But really cool, and it's a neat example of what is possible in resin. Over time, actually worth mentioning is over time, as you spin this around and play with it, you will see wear on there as the resin kind of grinds against the other side. Don't really be alarmed, but that's what that is. It's kind of the same effect as when you bend a piece of plastic and it gets that kind of white look to it. Same kind of thing. And then I printed this. This is super cool. So I think this was called the Knight, and it took maybe 10 hours, somewhere in that ballpark anyway. So he obviously comes out of the printer like this. And under here, all these little hoses and wires and tiny, tiny details were all supported by supports. So if this was the build plate, all these little poles were up here attached to all those pieces, right? Because you can't just print in thin air. And then I painstakingly, with a set of large like needle nose pliers or heavy duty tweezers, broke off all those individual supports. And when they were way up here under the cape, all the way under here. So there's no way I'd get my fat fingers in there enough to break them off. So without a tool like that, you're gonna have a really bad time. Now, if you're lucky, you can grab a bunch of them and kind of twist and break them off all the way up there. But in many cases, you really had to get in there. And I mean, there was supports all under the feet here, and it was quite the ordeal. Each little support leaves a tiny little pock mark. And in some cases, I can't even tell where the supports were. And then in others, I can see a little kind of scar where that support broke off from. So then obviously I washed it, and a print like this, there's all kinds of nooks and crannies for resin to kind of remain in. So I put this in resin wash and ran it in the ultrasonic cleaner for about 15 minutes. And then I did a second wash in isopropyl just to give it kind of like a final rinse, and then rinsed it off in water, let it fully dry, and then cured it. And it turned out awesome. And this resin ends up having kind of like a matte finish once that's all finished. Yeah, I've shown this to a couple friends, and like the level of detail in some resin prints is like mind-boggling, especially when you all you've ever seen is FDM, and then you see something like this. So hopefully we'll get some nice close shots of that guy. So that was my first impressions, my first look at the Creality Halot Ray. Hopefully that helps you as far as like getting you jump started and getting successful prints out of your own printer. So remember, if you like content like this, like and subscribe and ring that bell to get notified when we upload more. Thanks for watching.